Good evening, America. This is Norfolk Late Nite, and tonight on the show, we'll be taking a look at institutionalized racism with my guest Clark Taylor from Needham. Then we'll be having an original musical piece with my co-host Ethan Johnson and myself. I'm your host, Steven Olaska, and this is Norfolk Late Nite. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we're going to be talking a little bit on the pronunciation of the word Norfolk. Tonight's co-host will be Ethan Johnson. What do you think about that, man?
It's Norfolk.
Oh, all right.
Have you seen it spelled?
I've seen it spelled. I've been, just kind of ignoring it and...
So you just get to ignore what English you want and what English you don't.
Right, exactly. Just like the revolution, We're just going to be taking the stuff that matches up with our values,
The revolution. You think that there's any sort of revolution that can happen in Norfolk?
No, I don't. I think it already happened a long time ago.
Well, let me say a little something about Norfolk.
All right,
It's
Norfolk.
not exactly what you think it is.
All right, not exactly what I think
deep down,
it is.
There's something that's stirring, and it's keeping us where we are.
Right, this kind of like, oppressive hand of Norfolk.
No. It's more like some sort of secret society.
Okay.
That's made up of the Tri-Town.
All right, so nothing to do with Virginia.
Not quite.
Not quite.
When you go over to Plainville, you go over to Rentham, people talk about Norfolk. They're like, oh, you're from Norfolk.
Right. They have that certain pronunciation to it.
Yeah. What you got to do is you got to look them in the eye and say, are you with them?
Or with us.
Exactly.
That's the question, ladies and gentlemen. Are you with us or with them? Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Norfolk Late Night. I'm your host, Steven Olaska, and tonight my last guest will be Clark Taylor from Needham. We're going to be interviewing him and talking a little bit about systemic racism in America and how it affects you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Stephen. It's really great to be here with you, and as your grandfather, if I might, I wanted to say that I'm really proud of you for being involved in this kind of thing. And,
thank you very much. I try to be as active as I can in modern events and what's affecting everybody. And
right.
So, how does it feel to be on?
Well, great. Yeah, I'll just start by saying that one of the things I want to kind of impress on the listeners the viewers is just how deep racism is in our society. Now, as white people who are, I'm not really white, like white, but as we call ourselves white people.
Right, Caucasians.
We don't have to think about racism that much. We don't have to do anything with it if we choose not to, because it just doesn't affect us so directly.
Right, it's not such a major issue that we have to deal with it every day.
Yeah, and I can say that, we grow up with a sense of sort of internalized superiority, if you want. A sense that our way of life is the norm, is the way it's supposed to be.
Okay.
And others that have a somewhat different culture or a different history, a different way of believing and thinking, have a whole different experience, and therefore have to deal with racism because they bump into it every day. Now the question is, we can think of ourselves as not racist, but the system itself encompasses racism. That whole sense that we have that we're superior, that our our way is the best.
That sense of thinking is a very troubling one. I also have one question. Do you think other races that are not Caucasian, do they think they're superior or have a superiority as well?
The difference is they don't hold the power. Because most of the people who hold the upper ranks of power, now we have a black president, so that's changing. But if you look across the whole corporate world, across the whole business world in general, most of the top people are white. And even though that's changing, it's changing slowly. And so you think of what's been happening in the United States in recent months with police incidents in Ferguson,
the escalating
Cleveland,
violence
and New York City, and not Philadelphia, but Baltimore. There's a fear on the part of people about dealing with the police, and I never had that. My whole idea as I was growing up was that the police were there to protect and to
to protect and serve
keep the community safe. But it isn't that way for other people, because the police have been used to control and essentially oppress, not in their own conscious thinking. They don't look at it that way, but it's all the way that things have come down and the ways that blacks in particular have been viewed through the ages, starting with slavery. Black people were brought here and treated as property. They were owned. They were owned.
We literally sold them off and made slaves out of them. Unfortunately,
they couldn't even be married. Because they didn't own their own children, because they were separate pieces of property for the slave owner, and they could be sold off as soon as they were able to get into the market and be available for sale. So that is just a history so different. And what you have to think about is that whites who had the control, the power, who were the owners, the planters, they had this definite sense of superiority. And the only way that they could define themselves in relation to their slaves was that they were a lesser form of human being, sort of on the level of cattle. You own cattle or horses. Horses pull plows, mules pull plows. Humans, or black humans, that subhuman
right, so their
classification.
definition of superiority through their control over another race. Now, do
Yeah.
you think that their definition of superiority has changed nowadays since
Well, see,
they're...
here's the thing. Roots got down pretty deep in
Okay.
people's thinking and their consciousness, and that was an acceptable way of being.
Exactly.
To think of, and to be afraid of that the slaves might revolt, so you had to keep a tight control all the way along and use the whip, whatever.
So there was a fear and a pressure there on the white people as
Oh.
well to keep control.
Absolutely. And then along came, I'm just moving very quickly here, along came the Civil War.
Right.
And that was fought over slavery, whatever anybody might say about states' rights or whatever. But the reason that the whites in the South wanted to maintain their control and their states' rights was so that they could have the power over their slaves.
Exactly, so that they could keep their superiority.
And they were fighting to be able to maintain and have that for the future as well. And that came to an end in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, which President Lincoln,
Yep.
announced, and slaves were to go free. And then at the end of the war in 1865, there was a bureau in the national government, now what used to be the Union of the United States and the northern states. There was a Freedmen's Bureau, and they sent down troops to enforce and slaves were given freedom and the right to vote, the right to marry,
Right. Okay.
the right to marry, and the right to own their own business, whatever. And they took that seriously. And the northern troops were there to guarantee that that was available to them. Now,
Okay, so certain good things did come out of the war then.
yeah, that's right. In fact, it was called the Second Revolution in some of the reading I've done. And
Right.
The revolution was the freeing of the slaves, and that they were human beings in the full sense of the word. That was revolutionary.
Exactly. No longer a sense of I'm property, it's
Yeah.
more I'm a human being.
That's right.
Exactly.
And I have rights, and I can vote, and I can change things. And that, for the whites at that time, that is, and particularly the planters that had all this cheap labor, now they had to pay for it.
Right,
And
right.
they were pretty much just knocked out of the saddle. You know, they became, if not bankrupt,
Mm-hmm.
at least pretty hurting economically. And that was a period of time that things were changing all over the place. But the whites, the planters, they were seething. Here, if you can picture it, they had lost. So there was, first of all, the
Right.
failure.
Total defeat.
Failure of their military strategy. And secondly, they had these northerners there that was lording it over them and telling them what to do, and telling
Exactly.
them that they had to treat their slaves like full human beings.
So there's a lot of bitter resentment in the South there then.
Bitter, seething resentment. Plus, they had all this free labor, and they began to think, how can we get that back? And
right.
we can't call it slavery, we have to call it something else. So they hit on a scheme that they would find reasons to arrest black people.
Okay, so they'd find an excuse, find a reason, make the arrest.
Black men particularly. And the reasons were practically, they were just sort of random. And like vagrancy, we caught you hanging out. We caught you looking at a white woman the wrong way. This or that sort of thing, being too noisy.
These mundane things.
Yeah, so that went on, and then they arrested tens of thousands of black people and put them in prison.
Oh, wow.
And then they were leased from the prisons to the businesses.
So
now, the workers themselves didn't get any. I'm going to go a little faster.
Sure.
The workers themselves didn't get any pay.
Oh, man.
So they were slaves. So there's a book called Slavery by Another Name, and that is what was happening. They were enslaved, but through the prison system.
So through the prison industrial complex, basically.
Yeah, and that was in what they call the Jim Crow period. Now, one part of the formal part of that ended in 1877 when the Northern troops were induced to leave. There was a deal made for one thing, and the deal was that the troops would leave. Well, then, once the troops were gone, then the enforcement was much harder for the slaves to maintain. Now, they could still vote until around 1900. Even they found ways of taking the vote away. They couldn't say you can't vote. We can just say you have to know the Constitution, or you have you have to be able to recite the Declaration of Independence, or you have to pay a sum of money, poll tax they called it. And so that the blacks were essentially wiped out of voting. They had all these rules about white and black entrances and that sort of thing.
Right, because with the same privilege, they wouldn't be able to, they knew they wouldn't be able to complete these tests.
Yeah. And that went on for right up through the Second World War and even afterwards. And then the new technique is, when Nixon was in office, he said, we have two enemies, the left, the political left, and blacks. And so what do we do about blacks without talking about that? Well, the same thing happened in effect, only they didn't need all that black labor anymore because there was technology and there was robots and there was this and that.
Right,
so
all
then
these
how do we marginalize and take these people out of circulation? Well, it was not through vagrancy, but it was through law and order. And Nixon said, we're gonna make drugs illegal, and we're gonna make stiff sentences, and so we're going to imprison people. And who used drugs? It wasn't just blacks, but it was pretty equally blacks and whites.
A lot of races.
But the blacks were the ones that were arrested far disproportionately from the whites.
Right, so they were the main target there.
Yeah. Now, so again, the roots of this are very deep. And people think, well, there's so many in prison, they must be a race of criminals, which, of course, they are not.
Of course, because that's just an assumption.
No, they have to live in all kinds of rotten circumstances, in ghettos in the city, and there's a whole history of how that came to be, but it's the reality even now, so that people were arrested and given designation of felonies, and when you have a felony in many states, you can't vote, and you can't get a job, you can't do this and that. So they were marginalized, and that's the situation today. So if you think, well, hey, I'm not a racist, what you have to realize is that the system has brought these attitudes of, if not hatred, then just, then bad feelings for sure down around black people. That they must deserve what they have because they've done all these wrong things all the way through history. Well, when you live in an inner city distressed area and your folks have to both be working in their bad schools and bad housing and this and that, well, young people get together in gangs as kind of a different kind of family, and so it all continues right into the present day, these really deep attitudes of disrespect and hatred toward blacks. Now we can say, hey, I'm not a racist, but the system that we support, that we live in, unless we're actually doing something to try to change this,
right? Instead of denial, try to be active.
Profound way, we are guilty of being, racist is kind of a slicky term, but we have to deal with the burden of being responsible for this system, because we're not trying to do anything to end it.
Right.
So we'll just stop there, because we've just about used up our time.
All right, well, that sounds good. It's a very interesting topic. I think people will be thinking a lot more about it now. I'm your host, Steven Olaska, Norfolk Late Night. This has been Clark Taylor. Great to have you on the show.
Great to be with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, everywhere across the globe, tigers are exploding. please call the number on screen to help stop this horrible epidemic. If this doesn't get you to donate, I don't know what will. Seriously, who let that thing in here? Good night, America. Thanks for being on the show with me. It's time to get the hell out.